The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 26. New Allies. Even the smallest Dellblood boys had a hand in the sweaty work of dragging the felled sacred tree back into town. Straining and grunting, the men of Glenwood Village pulled the sacred tree, bound up in the thickest ropes they could find, all the way from the forest to the center of the village. At the end of their labor, the tree lay like a massive, unsightly prop in the center of the square. Kaleb sent several of the men back to their homes to collect whatever tools they could find and bring them back to the square. Not long after, the Dellbloods returned, dropping their rusty saws and dull hammers in a pile beside the fallen tree. The women present formed a curious and badly drawn circle of onlookers. Some of them murmured to each other in hushed tones or shook their heads worriedly. None of them had forgotten the threat posed by the statuesque woman in the woods. At any moment, a violent attack from the trained fighters who lurked less than a half-mile from the village might come upon them. Kaleb threw himself into the task at hand. Distributing the tools among the strongest of men standing nearby, he then directed 8 or 9 of them to take up a place along the sacred tree trunk. At Kaleb's signal, they all struck the light-colored bark of the tree with fierce strokes, but only Kaleb's axe made a significant dent in the wood. The men tried several more times at Kaleb's signal, but despite their best efforts, only scattered wood chips shot up from the bark of the resilient tree. Even Glista joined in the chore, using her sword like an axe, but with little success. "These tools won't work," said one of the men, who happened to be Lineage, Kaleb's old master, wiping sweat from the back of his head. "It's just no use, Kaleb." "Give it one more try, men. Perhaps the bark will give if we strike it a few more times," said Kaleb. "Lineage is right. It's no use," echoed Feralus, who had only just limped up to the scene. "This tree is too sturdy for ordinary tools to divide. I imagine the stone render that severed the first branch spent hours working away at it. We don't have the time to cleave this tree into useful bits before our enemies attack." "The stone renders are not your enemy," said Glista in a steely voice. "It is for Liston, who works her deception on them. They might be persuaded to turn back if I could only be allowed to speak with them." "That is a matter of perspective, young woman," said Feralus. "Right now your people are preparing to attack us, and I have no interest in talking it over with them while my people huddle here without arms. Now, Unmarked One, I propose that—" Here someone near Feralus, another elder, noisily cleared his throat. Feralus looked over at him, and the man pointed a stubby finger at his own forehead. "Oh, yes, of course, we're all unmarked now," mumbled Feralus. "But my point is, this tree is still magical. It would take many tools sharper than these to slice through this enchanted wood. We would need more hands, more tools, and much, much more time." Kaleb exhaled and scratched his head. "Well, what do you mean to do about it?" Feralus said to Kaleb. "You're the one who hatched this crazy idea. Are you able to chop it up all by yourself?" I don't know," muttered Kaleb. Groans went up from some of the men and women standing around the impenetrable tree. Kaleb shrugged and looked at Glista. On his face was the expression of a boy who has lost his way in a dark and thick wood. She sighed. "I could talk to the stone renders myself. Maybe I can convince the lead scouts to call off the attack." "Not while Verliston has their ears," said Kaleb, shaking his head. "Until they cease to fear your mother, you won't get anywhere trying to reason with them." "Perhaps I can help," squeaked a voice from somewhere behind the crowd of bystanders in the square. Kaleb and Glista spun around to identify the source of the voice, but couldn't see past the crowd. Rushing through the sea of bodies in the village square, they finally reached the other side. What they saw and heard there brought a smile to both of their faces. For bunched up at the end of a narrow alley that opened into the square were dozens of coyotes and hedgehogs. At the sight of Kaleb and Glista, they shuffled forward in a giant, messy, eager pack. At the front of the pack was Leek, blinking in the biting light of dawn and bouncing toward them, It was he who had shouted to them from across the square. One of the coyotes spotted Teva on the far side of the village square. Letting loose an excited howl, he bounded forward, weaving like a bolt of furry gray lightning through the gasping Dellblood's legs, to get to her. He promptly nuzzled his snout up against her black neck and licked the wolf's face. Some of the other coyotes rushed past Teva, leaping instead onto Grimwit's powerful front legs, like puppies greeting a long-lost master. The bear let out a rich, deep laugh and nuzzled their small faces with his large snout. "Oh, we've missed you so much," whined one of the smaller coyotes. "I've missed you little ones too," chuckled the bear. "Leek, where have you been?" Kaleb said. "I'm so sorry for parting without warning. It's just that I felt I was little use curled up around your neck in the woods back there. So when we watched your people dispute about that poor cub's fate, the one they put down at the front of the tree, it occurred to me that you might need some extra paws or teeth to teach that dreadful woman from Aberon a lesson. So I hurried back to Terrashine. Fallwrinkle and I put our heads together, and we decided to round up some of my dearest friends, these coyotes here, and invited them to join the cause. It turns out they were more than willing." "And the hedgehogs?" Glista said. "Well," Leek said, "I'm afraid they got jealous of the coyotes. They insisted to me that they should be allowed to help too." "Well, they're very welcome," said Kaleb, laughing. The Dellbloods, in equal parts horror and fascination, watched the coyotes warily. None of them approached the bouncing beasts. Just then, one of the larger coyotes trotted up to a small girl in the crowd and sniffed at her knee. The girl's mother nearly collapsed in a faint, but didn't dare take a step closer to the animal. The child, on the other hand, giggled and reached out a cautious hand. With a smile, she buried her hand deep in the creature's brown fur. The coyote opened his mouth and howled agreeably. Then he laid his panting muzzle in her two little hands. The girl pet the creature's nose and ears. "Oh, that feels so good," the coyote suddenly said. "Don't stop." For a moment, the girl blinked in surprise at the sound of the coyote talking. Then she broke into a loud laugh and buried both hands in the coyote's fur again. "You'll have to pardon their excitement," Leek said. "They've never been outside of Terrashine before." "I wouldn't worry about it," Kaleb said, smiling as the crowd's fear thawed into delight at the jubilant creatures dancing around their legs. "It seems the Dellbloods are just as curious about them. But we must get back to work. How sharp are hedgehog teeth?" "Not very sharp, I'm afraid," said Leek, wrinkling his nose. "And have the coyotes ever used their teeth on wood?" "I would doubt it." "Then I'm not sure how much help your friends can be," said Kaleb, shaking his head. "Though I must say," he added, "our four-legged friends are brightening the Dellblood spirits." "Wait, Kaleb," said Glista. "The animals may not be able to chop through the larger wood, but if you cut up the tree into smaller pieces, I'm sure they could carve out some crude spears from the lumber you break. At least that would be of some help." "It's worth a try," said Kaleb. "We can only do what we can do." With that, Kaleb marched into the center of the frenzied crowd, still dancing around each other like families separated for decades. "Listen," Kaleb shouted over the hubbub. "I'll chop the wood into pieces, about 4 foot long and a foot thick. You men split the timber I cut into spear-shaped sticks. The rest of you, coyotes, hedgehogs, put your teeth to work at narrowing the ends of each stick down to a point. If we work together, we can make a few dozen spears in the next few hours." "But we don't know how to defend ourselves with spears," said one of the younger Dellbloods, who had just picked up a dull saw. "We don't know anything about weapons, only tools. How will we fight when the scouts get close?" "I'll train you," said Glista, stepping up beside Kaleb. "We'll cover the basics of combat. And don't forget, you have the indestructible strength of these spears to your advantage. The scouts have nothing like this enchanted wood in their armory. So pluck up your courage and trust that the forest spirit stands with you this day." A few of the Dellbloods cast doubtful glances at each other, but others nodded and dove into the work. Gradually, all the men picked up their tools and waited on Kaleb to break the timber down. Several hours later, when the sun had crawled up to the center of the sky, the men rested. They counted up their spears. Kaleb's axe, the coyote's and hedgehog's teeth, and the men's tools together had produced about 45 crudely made but sturdy spears. "That will have to do," Kaleb said between long breaths. The workers sat down and drank deeply from water pots the Dellblood women carried into the square. Not much later, the men rose again at Glista's instruction to receive a short lesson in spear combat. The tired men massaged their arms and sighed as they gathered around Glista in the square. By now, Kaleb had left with Teva and Leek to scout the enemy's position at the western edge of Glenwood's wooded perimeter. Grimwood would stay to supervise the tired animals and nurse his still-fresh wound from the battle in Ablerin. Before Kaleb left, they all agreed that Glista would catch up to them with the men capable of fighting in no more than an hour. Tightening up her belt and boots, Glista began her lesson. She withdrew her finely crafted sword from its sheath, then making her way around the ragtag circle of Dellblood men, she showed each in turn where to place his hands on a spear when facing off against a swordsman. Just then, a young girl, about 12 years of age, judging by her height and appearance, tugged on Glista's belt. "What is it?" Glista said impatiently. She spun to her right and looked down at the child. "Little girl, can't you see? I'm busy training these men to fight. Run along now. You can help the women barricade the banquet hall in case of a siege." "But I wish to fight," the girl said. At this, several of the men waved their spears at her and laughed. "Can't you see we're trying to save your life, little girl?" said one of the tallest Dellblood men. The little girl pointed at a nearby pile of roughly hewn sticks. "But I see you have more spears than men," she said, lifting her chin and staring back at the man without blinking. The men looked around. They could not deny that she was right. Far fewer Dellbloods had volunteered for battle than those who offered to carve the spears. "We are in need of fighters," said Glista. "But war is men's work. It is not for women, and certainly not for little girls like you." "But aren't you a woman?" called another voice from the edge of the square. Glista looked up to see 5 other girls creep out from behind a building not far from the training circle. The young girl who had just spoken could not have been more than 14 years old. They had been looking on from a distance. Glista lowered her sword and stared at the 6 girls with a bewildered look. "Can't you show us how to use a spear?" the girl continued. "We do not want to stay at home and wait out the fight. Are not our mothers and fathers in danger? And didn't the log splitters say that those spears can protect us from our enemies?" "If you use them properly, yes," Glista conceded. "But you girls know nothing of the smell of blood or the sight of a dead scout. For 15 years I sparred against the best scouts in Ablerin to strengthen my resolve, not to mention my skill with a sword. You are just little girls." "Send them away already, Stonerender," said one of the older men. He laid down his spear and guzzled water from a wooden cup he picked up off the ground. "We have no time for this." Glista surveyed the girls' faces carefully for a few moments. Then turning toward the man who had just spoken, she said, "You are right. We do not have time to train these little ones, but neither do we have the numbers necessary to counter Valiston's forces. These enchanted spears are useless unless someone is holding them." She turned back toward the girls and smiled. "I say we let them join us." "What?" said one man, pounding the butt end of his spear against the ground. "You don't mean that you're going to send these little runts into battle with us?" Glista's eyes narrowed. "They are no more trained to wield a weapon than you are. Now, girls, pick up a spear that feels right in your hands and join the men over here in the circle. That's right, no shuffling around, move quickly." Reluctantly, the men made room in their slapdash circle for the newest trainees. Glista nodded as the girls scurried into the circle, lifting spears far too big for their little hands. "Now, as I was saying," the Stonerender continued after sheathing her sword again and picking up a spear. If they come at you with a sword, keep your spear out in front of you. Far out. That's right. Then thrust forward with both hands parallel to each other.